Okay, so we are recording and I'm going to let everybody in now. Hello everyone, thanks for joining and for your patience in the waiting room. We're just letting the last couple of people come in. Lovely. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I would like to begin this evening by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am currently broadcasting to you from, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm so pleased to be here with you tonight for this very special discussion of Steven Carroll's new book, O. Before I hand you over to our speakers this evening, I just want to really quickly reiterate some of the information that you were sent in the email with your link to join tonight's event. So you've all automatically been placed on mute, as you've no doubt noticed, and you'll remain so throughout the evening. But I will take you off mute later to invite you to join me in thanking Steven and Krissy for tonight's discussion. In the meantime, Steven is keen to answer your questions. It will just be a little bit different to how you might be familiar with a Q&A if you haven't attended one of our events before. If you have, then you'll know that we use the chat box to take questions. And you can type them in there, they'll come straight through to me, and then I will read them out towards the end of the evening with whatever time we have left for questions. So please start sending those through as soon as you think of them. The chat box is to the lower left of your screen, and if you can't see it, then don't worry too much. I'm going to be using it to post the link that you can use to purchase your copies of O from us at Avid Reader if you haven't already. So when I do that, the chat box will pop up and you'll know where to type your questions. And so it's now my pleasure to introduce Steven Carroll. Steven is the multi-award winning author of 12 novels, including A World of Other People, which was the joint winner of the Prime Minister's Literary Award, and The Time We Have Taken, which was the winner of the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for the Southeast Asia and Pacific region, and the Miles Franklin Award in 2008. Forever Young was shortlisted for the Victorian Premier's Literary Award and the Prime Minister's Literary Award in 2016. A New England Affair was shortlisted for the Victorian Premier's Literary Award in 2018. Steven's most recent novels are The Year of the Beast, published in 2019, and now, of course, O, which we'll be discussing tonight. And in conversation with Steven, we have Avid Reader's very own Krissy Kneen. Krissy is the author of 9 works of fiction, memoir, and poetry, including An Uncertain Grace, which was shortlisted for the Stella Prize. She is the current Copyright Agency Non-Fiction Fellow, and her latest book, The 3 Burials of Lottie Kneen, will be published in May this year. So, Krissy and Steven, it's now my pleasure to hand over to you both for tonight's discussion.
Thanks, Emma. That's wonderful. And thank you to all the audience for coming along tonight. It's my great pleasure to be in conversation with Steven about this book, O. And I was really excited when I discovered that you had written this book, Steven, mostly because I'm a big fan of O, of the story of O, and read it a couple of times a few years ago when I was working on a book that referenced it. And I found it a really intriguing and interesting work of erotic fiction. I was doing a deep dive into the world of classic erotica at the time. And the story of O really piqued my interest because it was a little bit different from all of the other work that was around at the time. So yeah, I was really interested to see that you had also been interested by the story of O. And I just thought before I'll get you to do a little bit of a reading from your book, but before I do that, what was it about the story of O particularly that piqued your interest when you decided to dive in and write this book?
I read it because I was in the mid-90s, because I was just starting my 3rd novel, which is called became the love song of Lucy McBride, and I knew there'd be some erotic sections in it because the pop demanded it. So I went off to buy Anais Nin to get, because they're very hard. It's very hard to write. You know, sex scenes are just notoriously difficult. One false step and you're into cliche or you're into mere functionalism. It's very difficult stuff. So I was actually, I did a bit of reading. So I went to the bookshop and I got Anais Nin, and alongside Anais Nin was Story of O in that same part of the bookshop. And I'd heard of it, but I didn't really know much about it. And I don't think I read it straight away, but once I did read it, late 90s or so, what actually struck me as I was reading it, and I knew the context historically a little bit, but it was just, to me, it was just the repetition of key words. I mean, it's a novella, really. It's only about 45,000 words. There's not much to it. But the repetition of key words like surrender, submission, defeat, outside power, masters, humiliation, captive, prisoner, and the occasional occupation as well. I mean, those words, I counted them, they come back again and again in the novel around about 150 times, you know, and that's a lot. And I was thinking, now, this is very odd, because this is pretty much the language of war as much as the language of erotics. And I started to think about the plot as well, that O willingly prostitutes herself to please her boyfriend. And it's somewhere along the way, the idea that this could actually be an unconscious metaphor for the most shameful phase in French history, that is the occupation of France. And look, had Story of O been written 20 years later, it wouldn't have mattered, but it was written in the direct rain shadow of the occupation. And so it was the key words that got me in there thinking, this is actually reflecting something that it doesn't even know it is. And it was the plot, you know, I mean, and at the time of the Second World War, a common image, especially in literature, was of France as the whore who rolled over all too easily, and Marshal Pétain, the leader of Vichy France, as being the pimp who pimped his own country. And so the two came together, the key words and the plot. And I came to the conclusion that it's quite possible, this is sort of deconstructive reading of Story of O, but in fiction, and I came to the conclusion that this could actually be what's really going on here. You know, what would you call it? The sort of, you know, the
metaphor for the real world.
Yeah, for the abject nature of the experience that they'd just all been through. So once that started clicking over, the novel started happening in my head. But I sat on it for 10 years.
That's really interesting. We'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Because I do want people to right up front get an idea of the style of the book. And you've chosen a little section from the book to read, which is, is that about halfway through?
Yeah, it's about halfway through, yeah.
Yeah, can you tell us what you're going to just give us a taste of tonight?
Yeah, okay. Look, certain things you can't make up. And Pauline Riage was the nom de plume of Dominique Horry, and that wasn't even her name. Her real name was Anne Duclos, and she had Dominique Horry was her resistance name, and she had a few other resistance names as well. But she was an astonishingly sophisticated intelligence. She translated. She worked for Gallimard. And she was the first woman ever to sit on the Gallimard reading committee. That is, the committee decides what they publish. So she was sitting there with, you know, her lover, Jean Paulhan, who was one of the immortals of French literature, and also Camus was on the reading committee. But when Story of O was sent to Gallimard to be considered in manuscript form, the only people at the committee meeting who knew who Pauline Riage was were Dominique Horry and Jean Paulhan, Dominique Horry's lover, for whom she wrote Story of O. Nobody else in the room knew. So it's almost a sort of, it's a bit like a Fado farce that was going on. It was that. So this is what I'm going to read from that
Right.
section. Who is Pauline Réage? The eyes of Albert Camus are about to leap from their sockets, and the woman to whom the question is addressed, Dominique, is so drawn to his eyes that she forgets the question. Not only is the question delivered with an inquisitorial stare, it is delivered with the thunderous crack of a manuscript hitting the large oval table at which they are sitting, along with 5 others in the committee reading room of Gallimard Publishing. The question and the sound of the manuscript hitting the table hang in the air. This is where they decide what will be published and what will not. And all afternoon, committee members have been banging manuscripts on the table, accompanied by a yes or a no, as emphatic as the banging. To anyone listening outside, the meeting would seem like a series of explosions and heated arguments, almost a brawl, which in many ways it is. For this, after all, is the clearinghouse of Gallimard. To those at this table, not just a publishing house, but a world unto itself, almost a wing of government, the clearinghouse of the committee, a kind of cabinet. What they publish here matters. Only the best, only that which defines the country. What it is thinking and feeling, from the vacant eyes of small town squares in the middle of a drowsy summer's day to the acrid, tobacco-drenched cafes of Paris, where habitués sit arguing into the night like some unofficial parliament. What they publish here must not only be the best, but must define the nation at this particular time in all its meanness and majesty. For the war and the occupation are still close enough to be yesterday. Feelings are still raw, everybody's still growing back a layer of skin. Peace, Dominique notes to herself, can be ugly. There are scores to be settled, memories both true and invented to be aired, fingers to be pointed. There all the time underneath the apparent normality of everybody going about their business, getting on with things after a bad dream that is best forgotten. For as much as the cafes may be full of furious debate, most of the country just wants to get on with things, let the past be and drink the medicine of blissful amnesia, not so much forget things as pretend they never happened. What they decide to publish to those here in this room has possibly never mattered as much as it does now. Specks of dust rise from the table as Camus, temples pulsing, bangs the manuscript with his fist, his unanswered question still hanging in the air. And then with a raising of the eyebrows and a puff of smoke, he moves to judgment. I say yes, we must publish this. He pauses briefly, looking at Dominique and others at the table, then continues, but no woman could ever have written such a book, he says, staring down at the table. It's a fine book, an elegant book, shocking, brutal, honest, but only a man could have written such a thing. It is at this point that the head of Gallimard himself, the imposing 74-year-old Gaston Gallimard, leans forward, patrician forehead and nose thrust out, and speaks as emphatically negative as Camus is positive. No. He too holds up the copy of the manuscript, bringing it down on the table, the crack of the impact ringing out around the room. Smut! This, he thunders, is nothing but a little bit of porn. There are cries of agreement around the table, but Gaston Gallimard, who founded the house, is determined it will not publish this thing. It is nothing but filth, Albert, and not only filth, but demeaning to all women. Do you really want your wife to read this, or your daughters, gentlemen, or your mother, heaven forbid? We are Gallimard, for God's sake. This book will never go into the world with my name on it. He fixes Camus in his sights. Albert, how can you, a man of such culture, intelligence and artistry, not recognize smut when you see it? Not smut, says Camus. Art. Gaston Gallimard is incredulous. Art. Again, there is a divided chorus of yes and no, of smut and art. Camus and Gallimard eyeballing each other, and all the time the conservatively dressed petite figure of Dominique Aury, who, before the meeting started, passed around a tray of visitants, her favourite biscuits, which he bakes for every committee meeting, sits silently watching the whole spectacle, impassive, giving nothing away except for the slightest hint of amusement. Just a taste.
Well done, well done. Look, it just a taste, and also it opens up so much that is so interesting about this book. There's one of the things that is fascinating about the book is that it really is set in the heart of the publishing industry in Paris at the time, and a time that we hear a little bit about if you're interested in publishing at all. And here you are sort of wading into a very, very influential set of people who kind of set the tastes at the time. And even though we think about the French as being, the most permissive, really, compared to Australia, who, was obviously so censorious that we were, we were censoring books way past the time when we should have known better. But it's interesting to see how the French also were scandalized by this book at the time, when you wouldn't really think so, thinking about it now.
Yeah, it's this is another thing that sort of got me thinking. I mean, part of the research was well, you had to go to Paris, didn't you? And it's any reason to go to Paris is fine by me. But I spent a fair bit of time there at the Cité Internationale in the heart of Paris, and I've got friends over there who lined up interviews with people who actually knew Dominique Aury. And one of them was, Philippe Soleur's. I mean, good heavens, one of the most renowned and acclaimed of French critics and novelists, wife, Julia Kristeva, so and I actually my friends got me an interview with Philippe Soleur's, and it got me inside Gallimard, and I interviewed him inside. It's an institution. And it gave me a first-hand idea of just what it's like inside that place. And also talking to Soleur's himself, who knew Dominique Aury and was intimidated by her. Everybody tiptoed around Dominique Aury. She had such an intimidating intelligence, and her reading was phenomenal, absolutely, and fluent in both English and French. She translated Eliot, Hemingway. She did the major stuff, So the research actually equipped me to being daring enough, if you like, to actually go into that world. And to an extent, you've also got to be protected by your ignorance as well. So there will be a lot of things that I didn't know about. There were other people I interviewed, and I remember I interviewed Angie David, who did the biography of Dominique Aury, which I had to read with a French-English dictionary, because my French is a bit on the crap side, really. It's sort of fifth form French, and it never really got much better. But I read it with a French-English dictionary, and I got most of it. And she was saying, well, when you write this book, you've got to realize that it's not just about a book, and it's not just about an author. It's also about the French publishing industry at the time. And so that's a very astute observation, because what that inevitably fed into the book.
Is it the same? So when you went into the headquarters of Gallimard, is it the same place? Has it been in the same place?
Yes, that's right.
You actually could see the physicality of the space.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's they've changed the street name, but it's the actual place. Yeah, set up by Gaston Gallimard in 1923 or something like that. I'm not sure.
And did you tell them about your kind of analysis that there's all this stuff about France during the war embedded in that book? Were you kind of forthcoming?
The people who set up the interview did give the resume that I provided, and I thought Soleur's knew about the idea. And towards he was interested.
It's a really interesting take on it. I mean, when I read it, I didn't even think about the context that it was written in. I was looking at the context of the work that it was written beside. So putting it beside the other books in that kind of genre and where it's at. So it's a really interesting take on the book to look at this historical context, and the potential that it was influenced by her experiences during the war is really rich, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
And
And that's why a lot of the book is actually set during the war. And she was in the resistance, and her lover Jean Paul Long quite possibly recruited her. But she was distributing anti-German leaflets pretty much from 1942, 1943 onwards. And that might sound like much, but it was enough to get you shot.
Yeah.
It was pretty serious stuff. And she had some pretty close shaves. So look, the more I delved into her life and the more I actually realized just how drenched she was in the whole experience of the war, and the objection and the humiliation and the shame that went with it. And that's why she was motivated to actually do something about it and join the resistance. She just couldn't stand watching any longer. So the more I knew about that too, the more that fed in to the central idea of the book. And I thought the French would be pretty kind of snooty about this outsider coming in and saying, look, I really think, you know, I really think this is an unconscious metaphor for a really shameful phase in French history. And like I say, Soleur's was interested. They weren't put out. They actually were far more accommodating than I thought they would have been. And this goes for other people too that I spoke to. They were aware of the idea. I didn't want the idea to be let out too much because I would look, whether rightly or wrongly, it struck me as the kind of idea that someone else could think of as well. I mean, if I've thought of it, then why not somebody else? And it happened to me. The first thing I ever wrote was a play about T.S. Eliot, the writing of the wasteland and his first marriage. And I thought, well, nobody is ever going to write a play about that because it won't be interesting enough to them. And so I wrote it because I'm interested. And by the time I finished the first draft of it, I'd heard that a play about T.S. Eliot, his first marriage and the writing of the wasteland, had just opened in London, Tom and Viv. And because of that, my play never got a gig. It was scheduled for a gig, but it wasn't. So it was an early lesson in keeping your cards close to your chest, because if something's, you know, it's out there in the ether, somebody else is going to think of it, especially considering I sat on the idea for 10 years too.
Yeah. I suppose there's always ideas that are swirling around, and they always seem to come out at exactly the same moment. So I do feel that's quite a universal experience. But I want to ask you about the fictional parts. So where did you decide you could draw the line between what was the real world, the research, the kind of hard facts that are in the book, and where you took that flight of fancy and made those big leaps? So did you have any moments that you were worried about or that you had to pull back on?
Not really, no. I'll tell you how it happened. I was actually in France when I was writing the first draft, and I was living in Paris, and I'd written about 10,000 words. I don't know how you work, but I block things out. So at the very beginning, I've got the whole thing blocked out. I usually think about a book for a long time before writing it. And I block the plot out, I get the characters, I have the whole thing. It's mapped out before I even begin. It's an early lesson from my days as a playwright. That's how I started, and I only accidentally came into novels. And so I had the whole thing mapped out, and I started writing it. And after about 10,000 words, I thought, this is boring. This is just not working. And the problem is that you can be intimidated by your research. And you've just got to say, well, let the dog off the lead. Let it run and sniff the air. And so I trashed. I've still got them, but I threw away the 10,000 words, and I thought, no, we've got to actually radically change the approach here and make this into a novel, as apart from a rendering of the facts as we know them. You know, that's biographers do that. Novelists do something different. And that was when I decided to introduce the whole thriller aspect to the book. And that was when I decided to make Pauline Riage an actual person. Well, with a resistance code name, but an actual person. And from that moment on, that is when I thought, well, it happens, but this feels like it's a book. And of course, Paul Embrage never existed. But I imagine that she did, and that she had a pivotal influence on Dominique Aury. So that's just an example of how you work these things out. And at the time, you're not thinking about the responsibilities to life and reality. It's just the nitty gritty of bringing the book to life.
Does that come later, though? Is there a point at which, when you've done the first draft, where you kind of go, am I going to get away with this flight of fancy here in someone's true story?
Yeah, well, I guess the test there is going to be, how do you feel about it when you've done it? If there's no bells ringing saying, oh, I don't think that actually does do the trick. But in this case, I didn't have any. I thought I'm just going to go with this.
Certainly adds this page turner element to the whole thing. It's kind of, this book does, it would be an amazing book for a book club discussion, I think, because it's not just a work that ties into history, but it's got this page turner thriller element, and it also has all these echoes into other books that you could then read that relate to it as well. So it's quite an astonishing piece of work.
Well, thank you very much. It was a lot of it, and mainly because I've always wanted to write a thriller. I've always thought, because I did the 6 Glenroy novels, and it was good to get out of the suburbs in the end. And books like this, just opened the world up for me. And I've always wanted to, I imagine sort of retiring to the south of France and writing thrillers. I really admire Len Dayton and people like that, and Le Carre, I think, is just brilliant, and so I've always wanted to write a thriller, so it gave me a chance to actually have a go at the thriller genre, whilst I'm also sticking to the literary fiction genre.
End of it.
But
it works. It really does.
As I was going through the book, I don't know if I'm sort of predicting questions or not, but it struck me that it was conscious and both unconscious, but it's also a book about books. It's also a book about writing and the writing process, and it's also a book about criticism as well. So all of these influences came into play in the writing of the book.
There's I'm going to circle back now to the reading that you did. So you mention it in the reading, and it also comes up when Dominique first decides to write the story of O, that the statement is made, a woman could not have written this work, that this is a work by a man, a woman could not have written it. And originally she wrote it. Do you want to tell us why what sparked the idea that she would write this book? And that was she was talking to her lover, Jean Paulhan, a very enlightened man, but a man of his times. And he had just read, and I think Dessart had just been published officially about a year before. And he was he was saying, no woman could ever write a book like this. Now, Dominique Aury had already read Dessart, because her father had a collection of erotica or pornography, and she found it, and she got in there and she read the whole darn lot when she was about 14 or 15. And it was her introduction to that kind of writing, if you like. In lots of ways, she's kind of recapturing that whole period. She read the darn lot. So she knew a few things about erotic writing. And she felt that she was losing his attention. They'd been together for about 15 years, and she's you can see it in an interview. She said she felt that he was moving away from her, that his eyes were straying, and the eyes stray, well, will the rest of him stray as well, and so she wrote it for him, never intended for it to be published, wrote it for him as a gift,
as something like a sort of almost a Scheherazade tale to draw him in and get him back. And it did the trick. She used to read installments to him in the car or in a park. And he was enthralled by the whole thing. And he was the one who actually said, you've got to publish this. She didn't want it published at all. But in essence, she responded to the challenge. No woman could ever write a book like this. And it was also written as a love letter to her lover.
Who was also married, of course.
Oh, he was married. Yes, that's right. Yes. This is France, for God's sake. But his wife had Parkinson's disease. She rarely moved out of the house they lived in. Very, very, very comfortable part of Paris. I went there. And Dominique Henry's apartment, where she lived with her parents. Now, see, the other thing about this is that Dominique Henry wrote Story of O when she responded to the challenge. She was living with her parents. Now, she was in her bedroom and her parents were sleeping in the bedroom next door to her, and she's writing the most scandalous book of the age, no more than 10 feet away from them. Now, if they'd known that what their little girl was up to in the room next door, they would have been shocked. Even though the father was highly enlightened, the mother was the opposite. So she did respond to the challenge. It was a love letter, but it was written also in a bizarre of circumstances. All of which just is catnip to a novelist.
Absolutely. And of course, Dominique Henry herself was bisexual and quite openly so as well. So if you for the audience out there who haven't read the Story of O, there's some you can her bisexuality is definitely on her sleeve in the writing of this book as well, because it's quite erotic work which sexualizes the women involved as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And one of her lovers was Edith Thomas, and they weren't lovers when. Yes, they were. They may have been. I'm not quite sure. They may have been lovers when she published Story of O. But Edith Thomas, a Marxist, poet, critic, and highly enlightened as well. And she was absolutely shocked by Story of O. And Dominique Henry was shocked that she was shocked. And she said, but you've read Francois Fenelon, Fenelon the Quietist, the 17th century Christian poet, who and the sort of quietism feeds into the central themes in O as Dominique Henry thought of it. Because, at the heart of quietism, and why Fenelon is, for her, was a figure in the background, is the idea that it is through self-annihilation, submission, and humiliation that we create the path through to perception and oneness with God. And it's a strong kind of Christian theme, and that was what she thought. Dominique Henry thought she was doing. That was her conscious metaphor. Whereas I'm taking it saying, no, that's the present, if you like, in deconstructive talk. That's the present. But there is always an absent present. And you'll find it either in the margins, or you'll find it in keywords that come back, or you'll find it somewhere in the plot. And I'm saying that the absent presence was the occupation itself. And she was utterly unaware of it. And so it brings in another theme, which is authorial intention. And just what do we know about the books that we write, given the sheer complexity of the unconscious and the process of writing, and also just the fact that we're floating on this web of language, which we don't control to an extent. Language is speaking us. We're not speaking it. It's to and fro. So all of these things came into the writing of the book. I found that actually it released a lot of stuff that I've been reading about over the last 20 years in a way that none of the other books did. This one actually allowed me to tap in to the reading that I did, and also critical theory. A lot of writers hate critical theory. I actually find it very interesting. I find it almost inspiring. And you asked the reading that I did. Simone Beauvoir, I read a lot of her. I mean, She Came to Stay is a brilliant novel. It's just sensational. Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter, I read that. The Mandarins, you've got, the Camus figures, and it's set, in the rain shadow, again, of the occupation, and that sort of period of purification that followed afterwards, which was basically shooting people. The purification, that is, purifying France of collaborators. It was a very nasty time, extremely nasty, and a lot of innocent people were killed during that period. But I also read Jean-Paul Sartre, Roads to Freedom, and that's a magnificent. I've never realised how good his fiction was, it's a really fascinating exploration of the whole occupation period, and also the lead up to it. So the reading was wonderful to do. I devoured both de Beauvoir and Sartre.
I think that's one of the wonderful things about the book, is because you have, read around this area, that it kind of unlocks those books for the reader of your book as well. So one of the things that that this book is like a key to a web of writing that I think people should be led to after they've devoured your book as well. So, I think that it's a really wonderful thing for a reader as well to have a book like this in the world. I'm interested, just before, I'm aware that we're going to go to questions in a few minutes, but I just thought that I'm interested in the fact that there is, the story of O is a book, it's a book about sadism and masochism. It's a book about power and power in submission, and a book about sex. And you have trod very lightly with your own sexual pen in this book. It's, for a book that is about some quite interesting sexual positions and behaviours, you have certainly erred on the side of caution with your own writing of sex within the book. Can you talk about approaching those sex scenes that you have in the book?
Yeah, I didn't want too much sex in the novel itself. I wanted a counterpoint, because, good heavens, story of O, it's all sex, but it's very, very, look, you could get it depends on who you are. I could get a line of people on one side saying this is a very fine novel, this is an intelligent novel, a sophisticated novel, and that includes people like Harold Pinter and Graham Greene and Regine Deforge, a really famous French novelist, became friends after reading Story of O. But then on the other side, you can get people saying it's just a load of smut, it's just a load of porn, this is nothing, this is totally overrated erotica. In fact, it's not good enough to be erotica. But that there is a lot of sex in the book, almost every second page. But it's always from her point of view, or Ree's point of view, that is respecting her intention. It's always got that spiritual, religious element of submission, shame as being the way to enlightenment. That was very strong in her thinking. I didn't want too much sex in the book because I wanted it to counterpoint what is already in the book that you're referencing. And also, it was a case study in lots of ways. It's an analysis. I would argue a deconstructive reading of Story of O, but it's also a case study of a woman, of the woman who wrote it. So it's not an erotic novel, but it is a case study of a woman who wrote an erotic novel, and that was actually pretty deliberate. I didn't want to actually imitate O. I wanted to explore and investigate O.
You also, it could have been tempting to end the book just after the release of the book in France, but you have chosen not to. You've chosen to see the echoes of this work and on her life for a while afterwards. Was that, I gather, given that you do plot your things out quite...
That I'll tell you what happened. I plotted the book out, but once I decided to let the dog loose, everything I'd plotted went out the window. It became free for all. And so all of those scenes that followed, I just inevitably followed her life right through, and just how this affected her all through her life, because she didn't actually own up to being Pauline Réage until I think it was 1993, when the New Yorker article was published. And of course, she would have lost a job at Gallimard. Her parents would have disowned her. It was extremely difficult. But I wanted to follow the whole thing right through, so you get the fullness of her life, not just at that moment when the book was published, but the repercussions of the whole thing. And don't forget that it was such a scandal. And I think it was such a scandal. This is what I put to Solers as well when I spoke to him. Not just because of all the dirty doings in the chateau. I mean, this is France, for God's sake. It was also because somewhere in them they knew this was rubbing a raw nerve, that the essence of the book had all the abjection of the experience of the occupation in it. And even if they didn't want to recognize that, I suspect is what a lot of people were responding to, and the book addresses that idea. But at the same time, there were people who were so fascinated by the book in reviling it that they claimed to be Pauline Réage. So who is Pauline Réage? That section we read. I mean, it's both a running joke and it's a kind of continuing motif through the whole book. And there were people claiming to be Pauline Réage. It was a sort of game. The publisher of O was at a restaurant one night, and he heard a husband saying, "Oh, well, since my wife wrote Story of O, our lives have never been the same." And he could not believe what he was hearing. But there were conversations like that going on all over France. There were hundreds of women claiming to be Pauline Réage and claiming to have written Story of O. So it was not simply an outrageous scandal. It was also a parlour game. There was a guessing game. Who is? At one stage, someone put forward the idea that Charles de Gaulle was actually Pauline Réage. But everyone thought it had to be a man. Very few people thought it was a woman.
That's interesting too. The idea that there wasn't a clear person who was the author of the book meant that it could have been a man. So therefore, we need to take it seriously. Whereas perhaps if she had come out as being the author of the book earlier and people knew it was a woman, then we would have gone, "Oh, that's just erotica written by a woman."
Yeah,
so this isn't fluff.
Yeah,
not interesting.
Frivolous. Yeah. Well, don't forget, it was a sleeper. It was released in 1954. And it sold about 900 copies for the whole of that year. Then it won a really prestigious French prize, the Dermagot Prix de Literature, and edging out Francois Sargon, Not a Certain Smile, the one before that. What's it called? Bonjour Tristesse. Yeah. So she edged out Bonjour Tristesse to win this really coveted award. And from that moment on, the book just took off. And to this day, Story of O is the biggest selling French novel outside of France. Now, but what you say is very interesting. Had she had people known that it was a woman who wrote it, it could have been a totally different story.
It would have been a complete flop, I think. Just given the history of erotic fiction and the women who get sidelined and the men who get championed, so I think that would be definitely on the cards. I'm also interested, just the last thing before we go to questions as well, I'm interested in the fact that when the book was published in the US, it led to a book burning.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Burnings.
I've forgotten who burnt it now. I think it was a Christian group who actually burnt it. Now, this is years after it had been published. So the scandal had died down completely, in France. But I think it was 67 or something, and the book was actually burned. So we do live in a relatively an age where books are still in danger of being burned.
And sex is the thing that lights the paper, I suppose.
It is, Well, the book deals with this too. I think it does anyway. It's just a sheer anarchy of desire. It will not be controlled. Kundera was so good at this. He, I think at once. Reading Kundera, it's almost impossible to escape the conclusion that Stalinist Russia was just as afraid of the miniskirt as it was of the Exocet missile. Exactly. Both were utterly uncontrollable, and especially when it's female desire.
Yes.
And apparently, men hated Story of O, women embraced it. In varying forms and varying ways. This can only ever be anecdotal, but this is what Regine Devaux says. It was a constant pattern that she noticed, and it's because it is raw desire and the anarchy of desire depicted in a book.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Look, I'm going to open out to questions now. So, Emma-Kate, have we got any questions?
Yes, we do. Thank you. So, Stephen, a couple of people have asked if they need to have read or be familiar with the story of O to really get your book. So can you talk a bit about approaching it maybe for readers who haven't read it? I'm assuming that those people haven't yet read that book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, you don't have to. You shouldn't have to read another book when you're reading a novel. And I think I actually, because there are scenes in the novel where we witness Dominique writing Story of O and how she feels about it and the sheer ambivalence that she feels about it. She calls it at one stage her hideous progeny, which is, Mary Shelley's view of Frankenstein. And again, Krissy, this is the kind of reading that comes into the novel. And so to an extent, you get a pretty good idea of how Story of O works. And I don't think you need to read it, no.
Great, thank you. We've had a question from Bianca who says that your reading was amazing. Thank you. And she'd love to know how you refined the voice and dialogue for the novel and made it so authentic. And were you influenced, she had asked, were you influenced by any theatrical work of the era? And then she followed up by saying that understanding that you were a playwright first makes a lot of sense there. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I've never been afraid of dialogue. I became a playwright because I always felt that was my strength. For a while there, I actually fell out of love with dialogue. If you look back at books like The Time We've Taken and a lot of those Glen Roy novels, there's very little dialogue in there. I actually sort of go into internal monologue most of the time, filtered through the third person author. With this book, I got right back into dialogue. I love the work of Tom Stoppard, and there were scenes in this book that not just a Fado farce, but something out of Stoppard as well. And the dialogue was constantly refined. My partner, fellow writer Fiona Capp, read the drafts of this book 4 times. We were constantly refining the dialogue, making it as sharp as possible, adding to it, getting as much as possible of the resonances of the situation into the dialogue itself without actually specifically describing what is going on. And so there was a lot of work on the dialogue, but I love dialogue now. I've fallen back in love with it, and it was a delight to actually write a lot of the dialogue in this story. And I wasn't thinking, do these people sound like French people? I know a lot of French people, and they're different. They're definitely different, but not that different. And eventually, I decided, well, some people might think no, but the ultimate responsibility you have is to actually make the dialogue live on the page. I did have advice. Catherine de Saint-Val, a friend, French novelist living in Melbourne, she read it and she gave me a lot of advice on, especially on the use of vous and tu, which is, it can, I mean, that's a comedy world in itself. We don't have it in English, but they certainly observe it. The grammar of flirtation is real in France. So the dialogue, I worked on it.
Thank you. This isn't a question, but Patty says that the sheer anarchy of desire is her favourite phrase of the evening that you've used.
Thank you. Who was that?
We've had a couple of people who are mentioning how much they've loved everything that's being said tonight and the phrases that are coming out. We have a last question, which I saw here, but all right, here it is. It's from Maureen. And she says, Stephen, what are your thoughts on Lady Chatterley's Lover being banned in Australia for many decades? And have you read this book?
Well, actually, it's a book I meant to read when I was writing this book. I do reference it, but I've read a lot of Lawrence, but I haven't actually read Lady Chatterley's Lover. And look, it was of the time, it's interesting that when the trial happened, when Penguin went to the courts in England over Lady Chatterley's Lover, the prosecution, it was the book that was on trial. Now, people like F.R. Leavis were giving evidence in favour of the book. It was, so here's this book, the author's been dead for 20 years, and the trial's going on, and the prosecution got up there, and I don't know exactly how, am I allowed to say rude words?
Yes.
I am. Oh, yeah. Well, the prosecution got up there and said, this is a work of pornography. And he was talking about Lady Chatterley's Lover, which my partner, Fiona Katz, read it and says it's Lawrence's best. It's a brilliant book. But the prosecution got up there and said, this is pornography. Why? Because the word cock is mentioned 45 times. The word cunt is mentioned 33 times. And fuck and all of these words and he just totaled all of these words, and this was the prosecution against Lady Chatterley's Lover. And don't forget, it was the book that was on trial, and it was a jury that sat in judgment of the book. It's a fascinating event. That's another novel in itself. But eventually the jury did acquit the book, and the book walked scot-free from the courts and out into the bookshops.
Also,
I didn't read.
Sorry, I'm just saying, Lady Chatterley's Lover is also, it's like Australia was on trial too, because Australia was the last, last holdout against it. So it's almost proof that Australia is way behind the rest of the world.
Oh, way back. In Victoria, we had a fellow called Sir Arthur Ryler, who was basically, if his daughter didn't like the book, then it was banned. And don't forget, you couldn't get Ulysses. James Joyce's Ulysses, for God's sake. You couldn't get that. You could get it, but there was an edition. I remember there was a big fuss in about 1967 when Ulysses was the unexpurgated version of Ulysses was released, and it had the masturbation scene on the beach at the very beginning of Ulysses. That I don't think. And by God, when you read it, you don't even notice. You think, what happened then? What? And yet there are some people who knew, and they were deeply offended. And so that I think if my memory is correct, we got the expurgated version of Ulysses for a long, long time, and that's the late 1960s. So we were years and years behind.
Queensland, still, we cannot sell American Psycho without, we can't sell it in Queensland. It's still banned here. It hasn't, you know, you can sell it down there wrapped with a 18 plus sticker, but in Queensland, but in Queensland, we're still not allowed to. Mind you, certain bookshops may just import it from overseas and sell it anyway, but who knows who they are. I'm sure they're very quiet about it and don't say that on Zoom at all. It's been fascinating having a chat to you. And of course, you know, to everybody who's in the audience tonight, just, you know, when you race out and grab your copy of this on the link that Emma Kate has shared with you and is sharing again. So when you purchase a copy of this, feel free to, you know, throw a copy of The Story of O into your cart, or perhaps Lady Chatterley's Lover, which is indeed an excellent book. And The Marquis de Sade, which, you know, is a little bit, I don't know if you went through 1,000 Days of Sodom, which
I think I read the first 30 or 40 pages, and it's not bad. But she actually didn't like Sade. She thought Sade was
repetitive. It goes on a bit. But
yes,
anyway,
that's what she thought. Yeah,
I do like Sade, but once you've read a little bit of 1,000 Days of Sodom, you might as well probably skip some of it, because there's a lot of repetition involved. Whereas O is quite a, as you said, quite a slim book that's easy to get through. So I read this in one hand and O in the other hand.
Oh, brilliant.
And went across between them going, oh, where are the echoes? And that's a lovely game for everybody in the audience to play as well. So
that's terrific, Krissy. That is a wonderful way to read it. It's a bit like watching Hamlet and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead simultaneously, isn't it?
It is. With O, though, you need a third hand, because, you know, you're supposed to read O one-handed in the first place. That is a very rude joke for the audience to end on there. Look, thank you so much for being in conversation with me. Thank you to the audience for being here. It has been my pleasure. And good luck, little book, out in the world. Let's hope that you make your way well. Yeah. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Krissy, thank you very much. And Emma Kate, thank you very much.
Thank you, Krissy, and thank you, Stephen. I can see people clapping. I'm going to let you take yourselves off mute now, right before we end the evening. And yep, don't forget to grab your copies, as Krissy said, using that link in the chat box. And thank you all so much. You can come off mute if you would like to.
Feel free to come off mute and have a clap. So if you can test your mute.
The Zoom settings have changed now, which makes this taking people off mute thing a little bit more difficult, unfortunately.
Got a few people coming through now. Excellent. A few people.
Thanks, everybody. Have a lovely night.
It was lovely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.